They say the foundation of a marriage is trust, but trust has this unnerving way of slipping through your fingers the moment doubt creeps in. I used to think Emma and I were untouchable, the kind of couple who would grow old together, whose laughter would echo through our home well after the kids left. For over a decade, we've built a life here in a quiet suburb. Our 2 kids, soccer games on the weekends, and family movie nights, it all felt solid, dependable, like the bedrock of my life. And yet, here I am, sitting alone in the half-dark with a book that is shredding that foundation to pieces. It started with the simplest of things, cleaning out the closet. I'd taken a few boxes down to the basement and was sifting through old photo albums when I found something odd, a book wedged behind the albums. Its cover was worn, with no title, just an old, faded jacket. I pulled it out, more curious than anything, wondering if it had been tucked away years ago and forgotten. But when I opened it, a shiver ran down my spine. On the very first page, scrawled in neat, black handwriting was a message, for him to know. Nothing stays hidden forever. The handwriting was precise, too deliberate. I flipped the page, feeling an uneasy twist in my gut, but curiosity got the best of me, and I started reading. The book's story felt innocuous at first. It was about a married woman in her 40s with 2 kids, living in a quiet suburban town in the United States. Sounded generic enough, half the families in our neighborhood could fit that description. But as I kept reading, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The woman in the story had a life that mirrored Emma's in unsettling detail, same number of kids, same small social circle, same routine of yoga on Mondays and Thursdays. But it wasn't just those details, it was how specific it got. The husband in the story was even an accountant, like me. Coincidence, I told myself, an eerie one, but just that. Still, that feeling in my gut twisted a little tighter. Then the story took a turn. The woman's life began to unravel as she embarked on an affair with a man she'd met on a business trip, sneaking around behind her husband's back. She was clever, meticulous, covering her tracks, hiding her emotions behind a mask of marital devotion. And yet, there was this undeniable thrill, an electric connection that drew her to him, like a moth to a flame. As I read, a feeling of nausea churned in my stomach. I tried to tell myself it was all fiction, that it was just some thriller with an unfortunate resemblance to our life. But then I hit a passage that made me freeze, a description of a small, secluded hotel by the coast. It was the exact place Emma had stayed at last year. She'd told me she was going for a weekend alone, to recharge and find some space, and I'd encouraged it. I'd even joked about her secret vacation when she came back. Now, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that the joke had been on me. I closed the book, my hands shaking. Every logical part of my brain screamed that I was overreacting, that coincidences happen, that there was no way Emma, my Emma, could betray me like this. But there was that damned message on the first page, for him to know. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a taunt, like someone knew something they wanted me to find out. I haven't said anything to Emma. The words are lodged in my throat, but I don't know how to spit them out. What am I supposed to say? I found a book that feels like it's written about our lives, except you're cheating on me. I can't accuse her of something based on a story, but I also can't shake this feeling that the story might be real. The question now is, who would write it? And why would they leave it for me to find? The book haunted me all night, but I kept it hidden, stashed under the bed. Every time I tried to push it from my mind, the words came creeping back, replaying in my head like a sinister echo. For him to know. Nothing stays hidden forever. I found myself staring at Emma in the early morning light, searching for any sign of betrayal, of guilt. But she slept peacefully, her face softened and relaxed. Was she capable of such a lie? When she woke up, she was her usual self, warm smile, the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen, and a quick kiss as she rushed to get ready for work. I almost convinced myself that it was all just a strange coincidence. Almost. I couldn't focus on work that day. I kept thinking about the book, turning over the details, wondering if I was missing something. So, as soon as I got home, I locked myself in the study and pulled it out again. This time, I read it slowly, letting each word sink in, trying to catch any clue that might have slipped by. I was only a few pages in when I noticed something odd in the margins. Small, barely visible scribbles were scattered here and there. They were faint, written in pencil, but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, trying to decipher the scrawl. The notes were cryptic, almost like someone had been leaving a trail of breadcrumbs just for me. Hotel key, second drawer. He'll never know. I've covered every trace. The words chilled me to my core. This wasn't just a random thriller, someone had been writing messages in it. Messages meant to be found. By me. I flipped to another page and found another note. Look closer. The words were written beside a passage where the fictional husband finds a hotel receipt hidden in his wife's coat pocket. My stomach twisted with dread, and my mind raced. I didn't want to be paranoid, but, could it be real? Could Emma really be hiding something like this from me? That night, I watched her closely. Every smile, every laugh, even the way she reached for the remote, seemed like a possible performance. And when she turned to me, asking what was wrong, I barely managed to shrug it off. I couldn't risk asking her outright, not yet. Instead, I spent the rest of the night searching. Her coat pockets, her bags, the drawers in our room. And then, I found it. In the pocket of her winter coat, a keycard with the logo of that same secluded hotel from the book. All the air left my lungs. My hands shook as I stared at it, the final confirmation I had feared. This wasn't just a story. Emma had been there, in that hotel, living out what I'd read in those pages. But why would someone want me to find out like this? And how long had they been planning this? I slipped the card back into her coat pocket, careful to leave everything as it was, my mind reeling with questions. This story wasn't just about betrayal. It was about someone watching us, someone who knew too much. The following day, I was on edge, watching Emma's every move with suspicion. She seemed completely unaware, smiling at me over breakfast, asking about my day like nothing was wrong. The calmness in her voice, the ease of her laugh, it gnawed at me. How could she act so natural, so innocent? That night, once she was asleep, I took her coat from the closet. The hotel key card was still there, as if waiting for me. I couldn't resist the urge to test it. I wanted to know if it was really for that hotel, if this key was actually a piece of her secret. So, the next day, I took some time off work, drove across town, and walked into the hotel with my pulse racing. The clerk at the front desk eyed me with mild disinterest until I slipped the key card over the counter. I found this and was wondering if it's still active. Maybe you could tell me which room it's for. I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He swiped the card, glancing at his screen. Yes, sir, room 217. It's still booked under Emma Stone. He gave me a polite nod, oblivious to the effect his words had on me. My stomach churned. Room 217. Emma's name. It was all real. I asked for the room key, pretending to be her husband, and he handed it over without a second glance. The walk down the hotel corridor felt endless, each step heavy with a blend of dread and anger. When I reached the door, I paused. My hand hesitated on the handle, as if some part of me wanted to turn and walk away. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. I opened the door slowly, the quiet click of the lock echoing in the empty hotel hallway. The room was exactly as I'd feared, empty, but hauntingly intimate. The unmade bed, a crumpled sheet left behind, hinted at a recent presence, as if someone had left in a hurry. There were faint traces of someone else here, a half-empty glass of wine on the table, and the faint scent of Emma's perfume mixed with another smell, something unfamiliar yet lingering. I could almost feel them in the room, shadows of intimacy cast across the furniture, the walls. I scanned the room, my anger simmering, and my chest tightening with each detail. Moving to the nightstand, I noticed a small book tucked beside the lamp. It wasn't something Emma would normally carry, a cheap, paperback thriller. Curious, I opened it, and there, between the pages, was a note. It was in Emma's handwriting, short and cryptic, "Same time next week." That note hit me like a punch to the gut, as if every suspicion, every doubt was written on that scrap of paper. It confirmed everything and more. My blood boiled as questions raced through my mind. How long had she been doing this? How many more times would she have come back here if I hadn't stumbled upon the truth? I stood in the middle of the room, gripping the note, feeling utterly betrayed. I wanted to scream, to tear the room apart, but instead, I pocketed the note and left as quietly as I had come. Leaving the hotel that day, I felt like I was carrying the weight of 1,000 betrayals. It wasn't just the note, it was the invisible ties between me and Emma, a marriage that felt, in that moment, like it had unraveled completely. Every corner I turned seemed to echo the questions burning in my mind. I needed to understand the full depth of this betrayal. I wanted to know everything, not just the affair, but the man she was meeting. I wanted to uncover the hidden layers of her life that she had so meticulously concealed from me. Over the next few days, I combed through everything she had, every nook of our shared life. Her phone, her emails, even her work schedule, trying to match anything with that damned note. I was meticulous, but she was careful. Emma wasn't the woman I thought she was, and I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I didn't know her at all. And then, one day, I found something, a text thread buried deep in her messages. It was under an unfamiliar name, disguised as someone from work. But the words. They told a story I was never supposed to hear. Mentions of their place and, next time, of secret plans and hidden meetings. Every word made my stomach twist. The messages were just vague enough to keep their secret, but clear enough for me to piece together the truth. Their place, their time. Little phrases she'd use with me had somehow slipped into their conversations, twisted in her phone into something private and tainted. The more I read, the more I noticed patterns. They met regularly, often under the excuse of a late work meeting or an out-of-town conference. She'd even sent him photos she'd taken in our home, in our bedroom, while I was none the wiser. There were things she did with him, secrets they shared, that she never brought to our life. It felt calculated, intentional, as if she was living two separate lives without a second thought about the one we'd built together. I couldn't stop. I kept scrolling, uncovering months' worth of messages, each one another stab, another confirmation of the betrayal. The part that disturbed me the most was the way she talked about me, barely at all. I was almost an afterthought, just a small detail in the way of her new, hidden life. The messages had their next meetup arranged. This time, it wasn't at the usual place. They were meeting somewhere closer to home, almost as if she was daring me to find them. A part of me felt sick, like maybe she wanted to get caught. As I sat in the quiet dark, phone still in hand, old insecurities clawed their way to the surface, festering in the cracks of my marriage. When Emma and I first met, I was relatively inexperienced in relationships, especially in the bedroom. I'd had enough knowledge to get by, but there was always this lingering feeling that she knew more than I did, that her world of experiences and desires was something beyond my grasp. She never outright said it, but I could feel it. And that invisible gap gnawed at me from time to time, a shadow that never fully disappeared, no matter how much we'd grown together. Seeing those messages, seeing him, forced everything back up. The quiet doubts I tried to bury over the years began to explode, suddenly impossible to ignore. Had she been hiding a side of herself from me all along? Was she more passionate, more alive with him than she had ever been with me? The ugly questions spiraled uncontrollably, laced with resentment and a creeping fear that I wasn't enough for her. Could it be that she never really wanted me, not like that? Images flashed in my mind, ones I couldn't stop, of her with him, giving herself in ways I could barely imagine. A brutal voice whispered in my head, asking if she'd ever truly been satisfied with me or if she'd been pretending, playing a role I never knew I was asking her to play. I thought back to our moments together, times I was sure she was happy. But now, all I could do was question, how many times had she faked it with me? And when she was with him, was she real? It felt like a blade twisting in my gut. The love I thought was solid was slipping through my fingers, tainted by these doubts. Had she saved her truest self for someone else? The thought was unbearable. For a second, I considered confronting her right then and there, but I couldn't bear the thought of her confirming what I already feared. The humiliation would be too much. Instead, I forced myself to keep reading, knowing that somewhere in this pain, I might find the truth of the woman I'd thought I knew. The days after finding those messages were relentless. Each time I saw Emma, a surge of bitterness choked me, mixing with the doubts that hadn't left my mind since that night. She continued as if nothing had changed, laughing, chatting, looking right through me as though she'd scrubbed clean any trace of him from her life. But the shadow of betrayal clung to her like a scent, something only I could detect, sharp and acrid. Every movement, every smile she flashed, made me feel like an outsider in my own life. The most painful thoughts came when I tried to sleep, images of her with him playing over and over, each scene more vivid than the last. What did she show him that she hadn't shown me? I began to spiral deeper, torn between a need to confront her and the paralyzing fear that what I'd uncover would destroy me entirely. I began monitoring her more closely. Small things jumped out, the way she lingered in front of the mirror longer than usual, her phone that never seemed to leave her hand, and those occasional hushed calls when she thought I wasn't around. They were all signals, each a warning shot aimed straight at my chest, telling me that this wasn't over. If anything, the affair felt like it was lurking right beneath the surface, mocking me. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I decided to dig deeper. When Emma finally went to sleep, I took her phone from the nightstand. I had avoided doing this for so long, afraid of what I might uncover. But fear was secondary now, I needed to know the truth, even if it tore me apart. I started scrolling through her messages, feeling the bitterness and resentment rise. There were no texts from him, no blatant messages to confirm my worst suspicions. But it was almost too clean. She must have deleted them, hiding everything with meticulous precision. Then, something unexpected happened. I found a hidden folder tucked within her photos, buried beneath harmless pictures of vacations and family outings. With a shaking hand, I opened it, and there it was. A photo of them together, faces inches apart, her hand resting on his shoulder in a way that spoke volumes. My grip tightened as rage surged within me. She'd taken this hidden part of herself, the passion she denied me, and handed it over to him. After finding that photo, everything changed. My mind became a battleground, constantly replaying the image, dissecting every detail as I searched for meaning. I started to obsess over every interaction with Emma, mentally revisiting every word, every look, and every touch we'd shared. Had she ever looked at me the way she looked at him? Had I been blind to this side of her all along? The resentment ate at me, gnawing away at my ability to see anything clearly. I felt stripped down to my most primitive emotions, raw anger and helplessness. Whenever she touched me or laughed with me, I found myself wondering if she was comparing us. The worst thoughts arrived unbidden. Did she find him more exciting, more passionate? Did she crave the thrill of sneaking around, hiding her secrets from me? Days passed in a fog, and my sanity started to feel fragile. Even the smallest things started to seem like part of some larger scheme, her casual conversations with friends, her choice of perfume, the way she'd dress when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Every action, every word felt loaded with hidden intent. One evening, I finally confronted her. I couldn't hold back any longer, the words pouring out of me before I even knew what I was saying. Is there something you're not telling me, Emma? Something you're hiding? She looked taken aback, confusion flickering in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a calm facade. She laughed nervously, brushing it off. "What are you talking about, Edward? You've been acting strange lately." "Strange?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Strange isn't when your life feels like it's been pulled apart piece by piece. Strange is wondering every day if your wife is lying to you." Emma's face hardened. "You're making things up," she said quietly, but her gaze drifted, just for a moment, and I caught the slightest flicker of guilt. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was imagining it, but in that moment, I knew I was close to unraveling something. And it terrified me as much as it fueled me. The tension between us grew unbearable, stretching until every conversation, every look, became a test of wills. The more I pressed, the more she closed off, becoming colder, harder to read. But I couldn't stop. The sleepless nights were taking their toll. I found myself pacing the house in the early hours, every dark corner hiding questions I was desperate to answer. The once cozy home we'd built together now felt like a maze of shadows and secrets. My mind circled endlessly around Emma's actions, her words, her dismissive tone that seemed all too rehearsed. The questions I'd kept buried clawed their way to the surface, louder than ever. Did she feel real passion with him, or was it just a fantasy? Was she truly herself with me, or had she hidden parts of herself all along? Had she given him that passionate side I had only caught glimpses of in the early years of our marriage? One night, as Emma slept soundly beside me, I felt the urge to leave, to escape the walls that felt like they were closing in. I drove aimlessly, the silence broken only by my thoughts, louder than any noise. I ended up parked outside an all-night diner, where the fluorescent lights buzzed above me, bathing everything in a harsh, artificial glow. The reality of my life felt equally exposed, stripped down to the raw, uncomfortable truth. The weight of my suspicions pressed down on me, suffocating me with thoughts of betrayal, and yet, no solid proof. I became desperate to uncover something, anything that could tell me what was happening. Searching for more clues became an obsession, and I felt like a detective unraveling a twisted case that had somehow swallowed up my life. I sifted through bank statements, social media, and even began to follow her, watching her movements, hoping for answers. Each new discovery, even the most mundane, felt like another knife twisting deeper. I started to think about confronting her with evidence, of pushing her into a corner where she couldn't deny anything any longer. But part of me hesitated, fearful of what I might truly uncover. As I watched Emma's every move, I became increasingly sure that her silence was deliberate. This wasn't the quiet of a guilty conscience, but something darker, something that felt planned. She wasn't apologizing, wasn't avoiding me out of guilt, and there was an unnerving coolness in her demeanor. It was as if she was waiting for me to piece something together, almost daring me to uncover a truth I hadn't yet realized. I had replayed every interaction, dissected every word between us in the past few months. But even when I convinced myself she'd slip up, Emma maintained her calm, a maddening reminder of how little control I had. Paranoia started to bleed into everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wanted me to react, to fall apart, and I had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. Instead, I kept quiet, determined to uncover whatever game she was playing. One evening, Emma left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. It was unusual for her to be so careless, especially considering how cautious she'd been since this whole thing began. The message notification flashing on her screen felt like a trap, too easy, too exposed. But I couldn't resist. I clicked. The emails were cryptic, littered with half-written sentences, like fragments of a puzzle. I caught phrases like, "He doesn't know," and "wait until the right moment." The unsettling part was a message in her draft folder addressed to someone I didn't recognize. "Just a little longer," it read. "It's almost over." My heart pounded as I pieced together that I might be the pawn in whatever she was planning. I closed the laptop carefully, but my hands were shaking. I felt like a stranger in my own home, trapped in a game I didn't understand. Whatever Emma was plotting, it felt close, like it was ready to hit me any moment now. The silence between us was no longer just uncomfortable, it was suffocating, a constant reminder that something terrible was on the horizon. As I stood there, my mind spinning with the weight of everything I had just discovered, a whirlwind of doubt and anger kept clawing at me. It felt as if the foundations of my entire marriage were slipping away, piece by piece. My thoughts went to the early days with Emma. I remembered how, back then, her confidence both attracted me and intimidated me. My experience with intimacy had been limited, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's depth of experience surpassed mine. Maybe she'd had others before me, men who'd known exactly what they were doing. Had she looked down on me all these years? Could it be that she had simply played along with my clumsy attempts at intimacy? The idea gnawed at me, digging up feelings I'd tried to bury long ago. The image of Emma with him, her lover, kept haunting me. Had she been more alive, more herself with him? My mind painted scenes of her abandoning herself in ways she had never shown me. The doubts began morphing into something far darker. Was she pretending with me all along? And how often? The possibility that she had faked her passion, her satisfaction, weighed on me. I couldn't help but wonder, each time we were together, was she just humoring me? Did she silently compare my touch to his? Fueled by this crushing insecurity, I could feel something breaking within me. I became obsessed with the idea that she could have been feeling more satisfied elsewhere. Every laugh, every smile she'd given him became a thorn lodged in my mind, making me question everything about myself and our marriage. But then, something snapped inside me. I couldn't just let this fester, I had to confront it, to force her to admit her lies. And maybe then, I would understand what kind of twisted game she'd been playing. My patience was wearing thin, and it seemed like every glance Emma threw my way held a secret. Her unusual silences, the small, inexplicable smiles she flashed when she thought I wasn't looking, each one clawed at my nerves. It felt as if she was in a world of her own, one I was deliberately being kept out of. One evening, determined to confront whatever secrets she was hiding, I suggested a quiet dinner at a cozy restaurant we used to frequent. It was our old haunt, a place filled with memories of simpler, happier times. I hoped the familiarity might coax her into opening up. As we settled at the table, I noticed her fidgeting more than usual. I reached for her hand across the table, looking her directly in the eye. "Emma, is there something you need to tell me?" My voice was firm but calm. She froze, her expression unreadable as she avoided my gaze. But it was the faint flicker of fear, or was it guilt, that I caught in her eyes that nearly confirmed my suspicions. There was more than she was letting on. The silence stretched, her lips pressed tight. "Why would you ask that?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart hammered in my chest. "Because I can feel you slipping away, Emma. I know there's something going on, and I think I deserve to know what it is." Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled her hand back. But just as she seemed on the verge of confessing, her mask of composure returned, and she met my gaze with an unsettling calmness. "It's all in your head, Edward," she said smoothly, her voice regaining its familiar tone. "Maybe you're just imagining things." My mind churned. Was she truly gaslighting me, or was I letting my suspicions drive me mad? I couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every conversation with Emma felt loaded, every glance she threw my way seemed filled with something just beneath the surface. Sometimes, she'd watch me in that way that sent chills down my spine, like she knew something I didn't, or worse, like she was waiting for something to unfold. At first, I thought it was just the paranoia eating away at me. But then, little things started surfacing. I found a half-crumpled piece of paper with a number scribbled on it tucked away in her bedside table drawer, definitely not a familiar one. A menacing thought crept in. Was she talking to someone? I couldn't think of any explanation, but I had this strange sense of déjà vu, as if I had seen that handwriting before, though I couldn't place where. And it didn't stop there. I started noticing things out of place, small details that only added to my suspicion. One night, I was alone in my study, scrolling through old photos of us, trying to find some sense of comfort. As I was flipping through, I stumbled upon one of Emma on the day we moved into this house. She looked happy, carefree, completely different from the woman I was living with now. I zoomed in, my eyes drawn to a peculiar reflection in the mirror behind her. It was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely, but I could swear there was something there. Or someone. I pushed it aside, thinking maybe I was just exhausted. But then, one morning, as I went to grab my phone from the living room, I noticed her standing there, staring at a photo of us from years ago with a strange look in her eyes. When she saw me, she quickly put it down, her smile a little too forced, her tone a little too sweet. "Just reminiscing," she said, voice light but eyes dark. But it was the night I found her whispering on the phone, her voice tense and urgent, that everything began to click. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. As soon as she hung up, I stepped into the room, pretending I hadn't heard. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before: fear. Or was it guilt? The walls were closing in. The last few days passed in a blur. Emma seemed like a stranger to me, and the more I watched her, the more I became convinced that her behavior was not accidental. Her intense gaze, overly caring phrases, attempts to pretend that everything was as usual, began to get on my nerves. But what was even more disturbing were the strange things I found at home. As if she deliberately left them in plain sight for me. That evening I was alone in the house again and decided to check our old photos, hoping to find something that would remind me of the past, happy days. But it turned out to be much worse. I came across a picture taken on one of those days when we had an anniversary. I remember how I caught her glance in the mirror. Now, looking more closely, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection I could see the figure of a man behind her. An unfamiliar silhouette who was definitely not there that day. I started looking further and suddenly came across the key, lying in her old bag. Her usual neatness suddenly gave way to a strange carelessness, as if she wanted me to find it. But what did it mean? And who was this man in the photo? My suspicions were growing. I knew I couldn't rely on my intuition anymore, I needed proof. That's when I turned to the detective. I had already realized a month ago that her goal was to destroy me. She worked on it methodically, feeding me new evidence time and again, but carefully controlling how far I could go. The detective was silent but experienced, and I knew I could trust him. His reports, which I received weekly, gradually added new details to the picture of my broken marriage. Emma really was not who she claimed to be. Her secret meetings with the other were confirmed, and the places they had been together matched those described in the book, as if she were deliberately leaving traces, playing with my thoughts. I began to notice things that weren't there before. One night, I came home late and found a piece of paper on the kitchen table, in the same handwriting as in the book. It said, "You're so close to solving this." It looked forgotten, but I knew it was a trap. She'd left it there on purpose, playing with my suspicions like a cat with a mouse. The more I searched for answers, the more questions I had. Things began to appear and disappear all over the house, old keys, notes, even strange little things that should have been unnoticeable, but I saw them every night, every day. She manipulated my attention, keeping me on the edge between reality and madness. Emma seemed perfectly calm when I asked her trivial questions like, "Have you seen my pen?" or, "Remind me where we put the garage keys." She would just smile and say, "You probably just forgot. You have so much to do, Edward." And I knew she knew what I was looking for and was waiting for me to break down completely. Every night I watched the footage from the cameras, expecting to catch her at the moment when she could not hide her intentions. The night came when everything seemed to fall into place. I was sitting in my office, studying the new security footage. This time, Emma had forgotten to lock her bedroom. Usually, when I got up in the night, she looked surprised, as if my movements around the house were a surprise to her. But that night, I saw on the footage how she slipped out of the bedroom, stopping in front of my office door. She peered through the crack, as if she knew that I had already given in to her game. I froze, looking at the screen, at her face. There was no trace of the caring woman I had lived with for more than a decade. Only a cold, tense expression, penetrating the very depths of my consciousness. She was biding her time, playing the role to the end. At some point, I couldn't stand it any longer and went into the bedroom. She was already lying in bed, her eyes closed, as if nothing had happened. And then I decided to take a risk, to confront her with the fact. "I know, Emma," I said quietly, but loud enough for her to hear. She didn't move, but I sensed a slight tension in her shoulders. She slowly opened her eyes, turned her head, and looked at me. I saw something new in her gaze, a mixture of irritation and boredom. "And what exactly do you know, Edward?" Her voice was almost indifferent, as if it were a trifle she didn't want to discuss. "You're always so sure you're right." I couldn't believe her calm. It seemed like the final touch to her plan. She was waiting for me to lose my temper. But this time I was ready. "I know that you're cheating on me, that you planned every step to drive me crazy," I held her cold gaze, "and that you left clues especially for me. But this time, you won't be able to confuse me." Her face remained impassive, but I saw her eyes flash with a strange satisfaction. "And what are you going to do, Edward?" She almost whispered, raising her eyebrows slightly, as if in anticipation. It was her game and she enjoyed every moment of it. I realized that Emma was deliberately provoking me into abrupt actions. Her cold gaze and calm tone were not accidental, she was waiting for me to lose my temper, to lose my composure. But I was not going to give her that satisfaction. I pretended that her words did not hurt me and went on the counterattack. "What am I going to do?" I answered with a smile, trying to maintain an icy calm. "Just watch, Emma. After all, you laid all your cards on the table a long time ago, thinking that I wouldn't notice. But I can see that you're waiting for something more. Waiting for me to give in. And that won't happen." I took her hand, cold as ice. Her calm cracked for a moment, but then she put on her mask of indifference again. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, but her voice was a little shaky. I knew she hadn't expected that reaction. "You know," I continued, trying to add gentleness to my voice, "I was just curious. All those notes, all those little things I found. I thought you were getting tired of this game. It must be tiring, leading me on for so long. But before you knew it, the evidence was starting to pile up against you." She removed her hand, but I didn't stop. "By the way, Emma," I said, looking her straight in the eye, "you should know that this isn't just a game between us anymore. I contacted the detective a long time ago. He collected everything he needed so that you would not only admit your actions, but also bear the consequences for them." Her face turned pale and I saw her calmness evaporate. She didn't say a word, but her gaze, cold, full of hatred, spoke for itself. "You thought you could destroy me," I said quietly. "But now, Emma, you're the one trapped." She was silent, but her lips trembled slightly. Emma looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a shadow of fear, one that she had long tried to hide behind a mask of calm. Her confidence crumbled, and I could see that she now felt cornered. She took a deep breath, as if to collect her thoughts. "You have no idea how many times I've dreamed of being free of you," her voice was cold as ice. "You've always been so predictable, Edward. If you only knew how tired I am of this pretense, your eternal routine, your illusions about us." I remained silent, letting her speak. Part of me had expected to hear something like this, but the words still cut like a sharp knife. "Everything you think about our life is a lie, created just to make you happy." She smirked, looking into my eyes. "Do you think I ever loved you?" "No, Edward. I always planned this moment. I was just waiting for you to get to the end." I listened to her attentively, and, strangely enough, with each passing minute the anger began to give way to cold calm. Her confession was no longer a surprise to me, I had prepared for it in advance. "And now you've told me everything, Emma," I said reservedly, leaning back in my chair. "Now I finally understand how long it took you to get to this point. It's just a shame that your skill leaves much to be desired." I took out my phone and slowly, without taking my eyes off her, pressed the play button. Her own voice came out, the same cold and cruel one I had just heard. She froze, realizing that her words had been recorded the whole time. "Did you seriously think I would let you get away with this? Do you think your plan would work?" I stood up and took a step towards her, seeing her face lose the remnants of its former confidence. "Edward," she whispered, but her voice no longer had that icy, haughty calm. She realized that her game was over. "Now your turn is over, Emma," I said, looking at her with barely suppressed triumph. "You wanted to ruin my life, and now I'm going to give you the opportunity to see yours ruined." With these words I left the room, leaving her in silent confusion, knowing that this last conversation would be the beginning of her own trap. Edward had prepared for this conversation for a long time, choosing the right time and place so that Emma could not escape or wriggle out of it. He invited her to neutral territory, a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where they had once spent a lot of time, discussing their shared plans and dreams. Now it had become the stage for the final act of their broken marriage. Emma walked into the cafe with a cold expression, as if she already knew what was waiting for her. She looked around cautiously, and then sat down opposite Edward, not smiling once. There was no longer a hint of love or affection in her eyes, only cold determination and a bit of hidden irritation. Edward began the conversation calmly but firmly. "I think it's time to stop this game, Emma. You've been playing it for too long. It took me a long time to figure out exactly what you were planning, but now I have enough evidence. You can't get away with this." Emma grinned, but there was nothing cheerful in her grin, rather, it was a gesture of despair. "And what do you want from me, Edward? A confession? An apology? Do you think I'm going to let you control everything like you used to?" Her voice was shaking, but she kept herself in check. "You just haven't accepted that you've lost your power over me." Edward looked at her calmly, not giving in to provocation. "This isn't about control, Emma. This is about the truth. You cheated on me, you manipulated me, you tried to destroy everything we built. And you did it coldly and calculatingly. Do you think it was easy for me to sit back and watch you plant evidence, trying to drive me crazy?" His voice shook slightly with suppressed anger, but he maintained control. Emma, without looking away, said, "And what are you going to do now, Edward? Intimidate me with this evidence? Ruin my life, like you tried to control me all these years?" He smiled, knowing that her words no longer had power over him. "No, Emma," he said, pulling out a folder of printouts from the detective's report and laying it on the table. "I'm just going to let you ruin your life yourself. It's all here, the messages, the photos, the recordings. And now they're going to be in my lawyer's hands. I'm not going to keep quiet anymore." Her face turned pale when she saw the contents of the folder. Realizing that her game was over, she tried to justify herself, speaking more quietly, as if trying to find a loophole to slip out of this situation. It's just a misunderstanding, Edward. You got it wrong. That's enough, Emma," he interrupted, feeling his anger give way to cold satisfaction. "Your manipulations aren't working anymore. I'm not your puppet anymore. You always thought you could control me, but this time you were wrong." She fell silent, her gaze trembling. She knew that her tricks would no longer help, and for the first time in their entire conversation, her eyes filled with fear. She realized what she had lost. Edward stood up, leaving the folder on the table. "Goodbye, Emma. Now you are free, and so am I." With these words, I left the cafe, leaving her alone with the consequences of her own actions.
What do you think about this story? Write in comments. If you don't follow our channel Cheating Room, you will probably never hear from us again. If you are subscribed, congratulations, you will not miss any exciting story. Thank you for listening to this shocking story with us. See you again.